Vice is a biographical comedy drama that follows the life of Dick Cheney, an unassuming bureaucratic insider of the United States government, who we see go from his early days as a washed-up loser with a drinking problem, to the youngest chief of staff in a White House administration, to Wyoming congressman, and eventually vice president to George W. Bush. Incredibly knowledgeable and ambitious, and having great insight and understanding into the inner workings of the government, he manages to quietly and brilliantly take on immense power, reshaping the course of history by pushing heavily for the invasion of Iraq after 9/11 and backing the most aggressive measures for the pursuing and the torturing of terrorists, all this while becoming one of the most powerful men in history. This is the new film directed by Adam McKay, who has previously done The Big Short, which was also a biographical comedy drama about the financial crisis that began in 2007. Now that film featured some very unconventional techniques of storytelling used in order to explain to the audience some very complex financial instruments. Now certain celebrities made cameo appearances, breaking the fourth wall, and addressing the audience directly, and certain characters also did that as well in the film, especially Ryan Gosling's character, who also served as the narrator of the film. And because of that, The Big Short was an incredibly entertaining, engaging, accessible, and easy to follow film. Now the director brings that same sort of bizarre meta humor into this film as well, and according to Rotten Tomatoes, that has pretty much dissatisfied a good third of this film's audience and critics, which was actually a pretty big surprise for me because I just loved the style and the humor of this film. Now I agree that the director could have toned it down just a little bit in order for some of those meta moments to have an even greater impact instead of being bogged down by the meta moments that really didn't work so well. But to me personally, there was only one element of this film that really didn't work at all. It's because it sets itself up as this big setup that really ultimately doesn't come to any satisfying payoff whatsoever. You see, the whole film is directed by some guy who we don't really know anything about in the beginning, but he says that he is related to Dick Cheney in some way, in a way that we'll find out about later on in the film. And when we actually do find out how he's related to Dick Cheney, it's sort of useless in my opinion. The most interesting aspect about the film for me is actually the relationship within the Cheney family. You know how they say that behind every successful man lies a strong woman? Well, that couldn't be closer to the truth in the case of the Cheneys. In the beginning of the film, we are presented with a Dick Cheney who is young and is sort of kind of this loser, alcoholic dropout, and after he gets arrested a second time for driving drunk, Lynn, his wife, just sits him down and says to him, gives him an ultimatum and says, hey, I want to be with you, but if you don't get your shit together, then I'm getting the fuck out of here. You know, it's an excellent introduction into her character and to their relationship, really. She, who is pretty much almost as an important character in this film as he is presented to us as a pretty hard ass. Despite this, I never felt like the Cheneys were presented to us in an all too unsympathetic way. Lynn actually campaigns for her husband when he suffers his first heart attack, the one out of 5 he has suffered throughout his entire life. And during like the late 80s, early 90s, when their youngest daughter comes out as being a lesbian, they actually decide to retire from public life in order to spare her the media scrutiny. Now this is where the film actually does its most clever cutaway gag. We actually get this false epilogue during the middle of the film that claims that from this point on, the Cheneys went on to live happily and healthily, which we know that in reality is definitely not the case, and even the end credits of the film start rolling for a few seconds, after which the film continues on normally. And during like this moment I was just like, what the fuck? Everything about this film is exaggerated. Everything is presented to us in this very wink-winky manner. It's very satirical. During like the second part of this film that takes place during like the 2000s onwards, when Dick Cheney becomes vice president, and this is where we have the two most entertaining scenes in the film. When he interacts for the first time with George W. Bush, you know, you would think that these two guys would have a lot more in common, you know, both of them being former fans of the booze, not the blues, the booze, I mind you, but it actually turns out not to be the case. They're actually presented to us as pretty much being opposites. You know, George is this fun-loving, impressionable simpleton who just wants to lay back and have a good time. He is very easily influenced and pretty much lacks any critical capability, while Dick is actually this very hard-ass, he's very uncompromising and opportunistic and cunning, who even seems surprised himself during certain moments that he is getting away with some of the things that he is. There are moments in this film when you realize that you are pretty much dealing with cartoon characters. This film is meta to the extreme. It's very satirical, and you feel like the whole thing is basically just this big joke that everyone seems to be in on. Even you, the audience member, feel like you are part of the gag the whole time. There's a scene in this film right after Dick manages to convince George to give him more power, when we see the Cheneys during the evening in their bedroom, and the narrator says that there's no real way to know what was going on in the Cheneys' heads during this very pivotal moment in history. We can't just snap into a Shakespearean verse that dramatizes every feeling and motivation. That's just not how the world works. What happens during the very next second? That's exactly what happens. They start talking in this very very Shakespearean manner, and about all things, about how they are being kind of turned on by this whole situation. You know, power makes me horny, baby. I think a lot of the qualities of this film are in the editing. I think they came off with a lot of stuff during the editing process, a lot of clever things they do. They seem to mesh certain scenes together. Like there's a scene, for example, when he is already vice president, and he is standing at the door of this dark room, reminiscing about talking to his baby daughter on the phone when he got his very first job at the White House during his very first day. You know, obviously those scenes were shot separately and probably intended to be included in the film differently during like the script stage, but they managed to edit them together this way to make it more interesting. And the placing of this moment in the film I think is very adequate, because it takes place immediately before he truly throws the entire world down the toilet, along with his popularity with it. You know, disabling action against global warming, cutting taxes for rich people, giving certain massive corporations certain regulations, not to mention pushing for the invasion of Iraq after 9/11, with the sole motivation basically of taking care of the unfinished business of taking down Saddam Hussein. It is widely accepted fact nowadays that Iraq had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11. You know, and I think this portion of the film does a great job at connecting Dick Cheney with the world as we know it today. The effects of all of this as we see it in the present more and more. You know, the destabilizing of the Middle East, the rise of the Islamic State, the ongoing effects of global warming that are not being dealt with, and etc. etc. The film is also quite nihilistic, I would say. There is a scene earlier on when a young Dick Cheney asks his then boss Donald Rumsfeld, what do they believe in? And Rumsfeld just bursts out laughing in his face like it was the funniest thing he has ever heard in his entire life. I think the film is pretty much encapsulated right there in those few seconds. I think it's absolutely ridiculous to think that these politicians actually believe in anything. You know, they do what they do for the sake of power. They do it in order to maintain their place in this very self-contained world, and to just ascend higher and higher and higher to other levels of control and power. So I loved this film. You know, biographical films about political figures can be kind of a mixed bag, I agree, but I think this one is definitely elevated by its comedy, its wit, its humor, and its style. You know, it's an excellent companion piece to other films about the George W. Bush administration, like W and Truth. It's also an excellent companion piece to certain documentaries that have been made about the brutalities committed during the invasion of Iraq. So I definitely recommend it. I think it's a great movie. My question to you guys would be, what are some of your films about political figures? Really curious to know about your answers. Don't forget to leave them down below in the comment section. Thanks for watching my review, folks. I love you for it. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and hit that bell and that notification thingy so you can see me later in other reviews. And until that happens, folks, don't forget to stay cool, stay awesome, and keep on watching movies. Bye, y'all!